If you ever want to read a Twilight brooding, emo kid style swashbuckling adventure where every man and woman falls head over heels for the main character, then this book might be for you. Hello and welcome back to my channel, Read Good, Draw Bad, where we love to read really, really good and draw really, really, really bad. Today we will be reading a book that I swear is in every university bookstore, but I don't know who's buying it. We are reading today Lord Jim by Joseph Conrad. We are going to go be sailors with Lord Jim, then go be gay sailors with Lord Jim, and then get married in really weird circumstances with Lord Jim, and then have a very weird ending. You're not going to want to miss this book on bisexuality and colonialism. You're not going to want to miss my thoughts on this book on colonialism with just a hint of bisexuality. Just so you know, I'm reading the top 100 novels as decided by the Modern Library for the 20th century. You can find more about this list in the description of this video. First, a TLDR on this book. This book is a narrative of young Jim's life who eventually becomes Lord Jim in Patusan, and Patusan is a place similar to Indonesia. And the person narrating the book is not Lord Jim, but it is Marlowe, the sea captain that's been featured in other of Conrad's novels like Heart of Darkness, and Marlowe is explaining from the start of when he met Jim when he was young all the way to Lord Jim's tragic end. And I'm not really spoiling anything, but I will be talking a little bit more about the ending, so if you don't want this spoiled, spoiler alerts ahead. The main incident that the entire plot of this book revolves around is the crisis of the passenger ship Patna, which is kind of similar to like Titanic if you think about it that way. And similar to that Titanic, the Patna has a moment where everyone on the ship thought that the ship was about to sink, including the captain and its first mates. Now, Jim, as a young sailor, gets up in the middle of the night to see that there's a lot of problems with the ship and someone should be taking care of it. But what he finds instead is that the captain and the crew are abandoning the ship and are encouraging Jim to abandon the ship as well. And young Jim, who dreamed of being a hero, a kind of sailor of the high seas, when Jim sees that it's hopeless trying to save the ship, he jumps off with the other officers in the same boat as them, quite literally, a little tiny dinghy boat. Now, if you don't know, it's basically sacrilege for a sailor to abandon a ship in the middle of a storm. And the captain and officers who abandoned the ship were fairly shady characters, which Jim was not happy about, but there's nothing he could do. Because once these characters sailed back to shore, everyone found out that the boat had been abandoned. And in a twist of fate, the boat did not sink. The captain abandoned a ship full of passengers, and it was reported back to the main authorities, and there was a trial. Now, because there was a trial, the captain and all of the other first mates and all the other sailors who abandoned the ship, they hightailed it out of town, and the only one left to stand trial for the abandoning of the ship is Jim. Now, this trial makes Jim into a scapegoat because he's the only person standing around admitting that he was guilty. And the incident with the Patna became an international incident that spread far and wide and basically made Jim the laughingstock of the sailing world. In modern terms, Jim was canceled, and canceled very hard. And like most people in the 20th century, when you get canceled, the first thing you do is get really, really drunk. Now at this point, the story starts getting really gay, and Marlowe basically falls in love with Jim and says as much throughout the book, but Conrad's not really allowed to say that back then, so there's just a lot of insinuations about going back and forth from people's hotel rooms. And Jim, as a young man who is caught up in the middle of this terrible incident, is really attractive, and Marlowe has some sympathy for him, and perhaps some undisclosed feelings. So even though Marlowe despises what Jim did as a fellow sailor and captain, Marlowe decides the best way to help Jim is to pack Jim off to somewhere where he would not be canceled, is to his friend Lord Stein, who's a very sexy, attractive, extremely rich older man. He basically gets him a job, lets him stay with him, and generally says a lot of nice things in letters back to Marlowe about how much he really likes Jim. Jim really grows on him. So Jim probably would have been fine working this middle-class job that Lord Stein had got him for forever, probably. However, someone who knows about the Patna incident recognizes him while Jim is at work. This was a fairly remote place, so this was kind of like finding a celebrity when you're out for groceries. And so word spreads that Jim, the sailor who was involved in the Patna incident, is around, and my gosh, let's all talk about it. And then Jim starts drinking again, which is a bad sign. And at this point, both Marlowe and Lord Stein decide we need to help him again to move on. And in this case, we're going to move him to somewhere really remote where nobody knows him, and hopefully he can recover. Sort of like when you go to a Betty Ford clinic for detox. Because they both realize that Jim needs to reinvent himself away from this sailor persona to be someone else. So they pack him off to the island of Patusan, where Jim accidentally falls in love with and marries a woman named Jewel. And Jewel is super in love with Jim. And Jewel, by the way, is the most interesting person in this book because she is plagued with various local political concerns as well as foreigners who are coming to her country, and she realizes the best way for her to get ahead and to stabilize some of the problems in her local region is to get Jim to become Lord Jim, or Tuan Jim, because Jim is a white man, and as well, Jim is somewhat of a heroic figure. For one reason or another, Jim is very charismatic, and also Jim carries a big gun. And Jewel is the most interesting person in this book because she has a lot of foresight about what Jim could do for her local economy. And surprisingly, when people started to believe in Jim as Lord Jim, Jim perked right up and is suddenly the heroic character that he always expected he would be, and everyone else saw him as super heroic. In other words, Jim is a total attention whore, but it does great things for his personality and his self-esteem, and also does great things for Patusan. Now, unfortunately, at this point in the story, we get a bit unlucky because the pirate Gentleman Brown, whose crew is starving and roaming the sea, happens upon Patusan and decides that this is the perfect place for them to rape and pillage. And they plan to do both. They plan to literally burn the place to the ground because they're hungry. This pirate shows up at a time where Lord Jim is away from home doing other things. And it is so unclear in the book why he's away from home, but he's mysteriously away at the perfect time when these pirates show up, but whatever. Anyways, Jim is away, and Gentleman Brown and co. start pillaging and shooting everybody. However, Lord Jim arrives right at the moment of crisis and talks to Gentleman Brown, the pirate, and says to him, hey, don't shoot anybody because otherwise I'm going to kill all of you. And that was like really bravado talk because it was literally just him with a gun, and I mean, it wouldn't have worked out well. For some reason, Gentleman Brown says, fine, we'll just take our stuff and go. And this is a perfect example of where Jim is trying to be a flawless hero. However, Gentleman Brown, because he's just who he is, decides he's mad that he's being kicked out when he thought they were going to live like kings, the way that Lord Jim is living like a king. The pirates decide to start shooting people as they're on their way out so that they make a clean retreat and the natives can do nothing. And one of the people that gets shot is Jim's best friend, the other chieftain's son. And this is a huge deal because Lord Jim promised the local people that he would deal with this peacefully and it would not resolve in lots of deaths of the natives. And the people in general are really upset because everyone loved the chieftain's son. So Lord Jim goes to his best friend's dad, the chieftain, and says, whoa, my bad, I'm sorry, I didn't mean for that to happen. And that's basically where the story ends because Jim takes responsibility for the death of his people in a heroic manner. And unfortunately, as part of taking responsibility for the death of the chieftain's son and of the local villagers, the chieftain orders Lord Jim to death, and he accepts it. Because in this case, unlike the boat where Jim abandons the ship, in this case, Jim accepts responsibilities for his actions, and in doing so, accepts his own death. And then the book basically ends, and everyone is sad. Jewel, his two gay dads, everybody. And that's the plot. Now let's talk about the themes in this book. The main theme of this book is moral redemption. And we can see that because the first example of Jim where he believes he's going to be a heroic kind of person involves him in the incident with a giant ship of passengers. And instead of saving their lives, he tries to save his own life. Now, if we compare to him in the village, he is genuinely trying to save the lives of the villagers and prevent bloodshed. And he accepts responsibility for his actions in a way that he could not or did not accept responsibility for his actions in the trial. This is a story about someone who dreamed about being a hero, and the first time he is tested, does not have the chance to become the hero he wants to be. And instead of being a winner, he's called a loser by everyone around him. So the idea of redemption is, How can you become the kind of person you want to be when no one believes in you? Now, this ties in with the theme of heroism. And you could also say the point of this book is to ask the question, what does it mean to be a hero in the 20th century? Because a hero should have all these characteristics that we come to know and love in books. They're tall, they're handsome, they're leaders, they have courage, they do things other people can't do. And Jim has all of these qualities. But he's also moody and messy and imperfect. In fact, he's a mess for 90% of the story and only gets his crap together once people start actually treating him well. But people seem to fall all over him because he seems to provoke strong emotions in others. This book is basically about sexual emotions and heroism. It's very weird. Lastly, thematically, there's something in this book about guns. This book is about the power of guns and what does the gun symbolize. Because ultimately, the gun is a symbol in this book that matters for Jim as Lord Jim because he's someone who carries the gun, and that's why people follow him. And guns are also a sign of conflict because guns are what Gentleman Brown carries and what causes part of the problems between Gentleman Brown and the natives. There's not a fair fight between the natives and Gentleman Brown, who are coming to rape and pillage. And guns are ultimately a sign of Lord Jim's death at the end of the book, and the author really wants you to pay attention to Lord Jim's gun. No homoeroticism intended. Now, I would normally go into the characters at this point, but honestly, every character in this book is a plot device. Only thing you really need to know about the characters in this book is that eventually the rule is everyone in this book falls in love with Lord Jim. The same way that, teenage girls fall in love with anemic Robert Patterson as a vampire. And while I don't think Jim is gay in this book, I definitely do think that there is an element of bisexuality in this book. He various times expresses huge emotions for both men and women in this book. And what the men and women do at various points in this book with Lord Jim is very vague. Let me read you a quote that I think plays into some of the homoerotic-esque language that Conrad uses. After the trial with the boat the Patna, Marlowe takes Jim back to his hotel for a discussion. He followed me as manageable as a little child, with an obedient air, with no sort of manifestation, rather as though he had been waiting for me there to come along and carry him off. It seems to me, on reading Denver's letter, that my friend has found more than tolerance for Jim. There were the beginnings of active liking. For one thing, Jim kept his freshness in the climate. Had he been a girl, my friend wrote, one could have said he was blooming modestly, like a violet. Not like some of those blatant tropical flowers. I really feel there are major homoerotic tones in this book, and it's strange because this is a swashbuckling adventure about a heroic man going to do heroic things in the heroic wilderness. It's really about a moody hero coming to grips with his own heroism. And again, his relationships with men and women in this book make me extremely uncomfortable, and I can't really put my finger on it. I often felt very strange reading about how other characters interacted with him. Now, on to the review. So when I talk about this book, I really, really like it. I like talking about the book Lord Jim. However, when I read this book, I don't like it. I really don't like it. This is sort of a writer's sailor's novel where it's supposed to be deep and interesting, but sometimes the plot was just so boring. And through a modern lens, I really feel like Joseph Conrad is queer baiting his audience, and on purpose. He kind of knew who Oscar Wilde was. My main problem with the book is that this is told through a secondary narrator. We never really know what Jim is thinking or what he wants to do. And I just have an absolute hatred for brooding men in novels because most of them are so one-dimensional, and Jim is no exception. If you read Heart of Darkness, this book has the same narrator. But unlike Heart of Darkness, where the secondary narrator is helpful because it helps us understand how weird and strange and dark the jungle seem to the various characters in the book, in this case, I find the secondary narrator just confusing. Because this narration turns Jim into an object, not a subject. Everything Lord Jim does is sort of in the past because it's as Marlowe is describing him. So it really takes out the agency that you would feel if we were trying to understand what Jim was thinking or saying. We're constantly told by Marlowe that Jim is brooding about his personal decisions and moral guilt, but we never see the results of what Jim is trying to accomplish. And Jim, throughout the book, speaks in all these half sentences that just drive me absolutely up the wall. And I'll give you a perfect example where Marlowe is explaining to Jim that he'll pack him off to Lord Stein to help him get away from the trial. This is Jim trying to thank Marlowe for helping him. "You are a brick," he cried in a muffled voice. "Why? This is what he stammered. "I would be a brute now if I must go now," he said. "Jove, you have helped me. I can't sit still. The very thing. This is an important passage in the book, of that I'm sure, and yet I still have no clue what Jim is trying to say. And he speaks like this throughout the entire book as someone completely shell-shocked who can't finish a single sentence. Some people might enjoy this kind of writing, but as a reader, I want to understand what the characters are thinking, and I don't want to have to guess what different people are doing or thinking. The writer should be able to tell me. And I think some people might find this really deep and impactful, but I found it really irritating. Because when Conrad has these open-ended conversations where Jim doesn't finish his sentences, I often wonder what Conrad was trying to say throughout most of the conversations in the book, and it makes it a real slog. But if you want to read a similar, and in my opinion better book, I would just recommend you read Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. Because more than anything, you're going to get the Yo-Ho bottle of rum, and I mean, that's iconic. It's also a coming-of-age story, and the themes are also about morality and greed. But also I think the dialogue and the point of the book is much better displayed, and it's also a shorter book. Did you enjoy this book? I'd love to find someone that had, and this book really resonated with them. Again, I love talking about this book. I just had a lot of problems while I was reading this book. Okay, if you liked this review, please like, share, and subscribe, and you can hit the bell notification if you want to know the next time I release a new video. Next time, we'll be crossing the ocean back into the UK, the United Kingdom, or Britain as it was called at the time, and we will be dealing with an orphaned, obsessive rich girl and her obsessive strange diary in The Death of the Heart by Elizabeth Bowen. Okay, well, I hope you're having an amazing week and getting some wonderful reading done, and as always, stay curious, stay reading.